I didn't find this out until I finished the series, but it turns out that Miki Yoshikawa, the mangaka behind Yamada-Kun and the Seven Witches, used to be an assistant for, of all people, Hiro Mashima. In fact, she credits Hiro Mashima for literally teaching her every single thing she knows about making manga. That is amazing. Why is that amazing? Well, here's my review. Yamada-Kun and the Seven Witches is a shonen supernatural romance comedy series written and illustrated by Miki Yoshikawa, and it was serialized in Weekly Shonen Magazine from 2012 to 2017. The story follows second-year high school student Ryu Yamada. Now, he's a bit of a delinquent. He goes to a really prestigious high school, but he's constantly getting into fights, constantly getting bad grades, and he's even been suspended quite a few times in the past. Now, one day he's walking up the stairs when he realizes that Arara Shiraishi, a girl from his grade, is ahead of him. Now, Shiraishi doesn't really have many friends, she's a bit of a loner, but Yamada knows her for her reputation of being one of the smartest kids in the entire school. Anyway, he runs up the stairs ahead of her, but ends up tripping. Next thing he knows, he is waking up in the school's infirmary in Shiraishi's body. Because it turns out that when he fell on her, the two of them accidentally kissed, and they swapped bodies. After doing a few things that any perfectly healthy high school student would do, he goes to find her, and sure enough, she is now in Yamada's body, and she's actually doing schoolwork, and everyone's freaking out because they have no idea why Yamada changed so much. Now, once the two of them realize that kissing each other causes them to switch bodies, they realize that they can both benefit from this, because when Yamada is in Shiraishi's body, it makes Shiraishi seem a lot more confident, and he can make her a lot more friends. And in return, of course, Shiraishi using Yamada's body can take all of his tests for him, so he won't flunk out. Eventually, though, Miyamura, one of the students on the student council, sort of catches on what the two of them are doing, mainly because of how different the two of them seem to be acting during school. He reveals himself to them, but also lets them know that he's more so interested than anything, and he proposes that the three of them actually start up a club so they can experiment with the powers and also have a place where Shiraishi and Yamada can switch bodies without trying to hide from anyone. And thus, the Supernatural Studies Club is born. And in their experimentation and research trying to figure out what is going on, they discover a notebook left by a previous Supernatural Studies Club at their high school. It explains that Shiraishi is what is known as a witch. She has a certain power that is activated through kissing. And there are actually 6 other girls in the school who have similar powers to Shiraishi, hence the title. So after realizing this, the club decides to make it its goal to find out who all of the witches are. They also realize that something pretty interesting happens if you actually end up rounding up all of the witches and bringing them together. And the student council, who seems to rule this school with an iron fist, does not really like this idea. You see, they also know all about the witches, they know what can happen if they're brought all together, and they don't really intend to let that happen. So thus begins a crazy series full of romantic comedy antics with lots of crazy drama mixed in. And honest to God, it's all pretty friggin' awesome. The plot here is so crazy that if you just tell a random person what it's about, they'll probably think it's crap. Like, you know what, there's no way this is good. But because of the lighthearted, fun, hilarious tone, and it's a lot more engaging than you would initially think. Especially once the story really gets going, because, you know, admittedly, it may get off to a bit of a slow start, you know, just introducing a bunch of characters. It does take a while for the first major arc to kick off, but once it finally does, you're gonna have a hard time putting it down. Now, this series is decently long at 28 volumes, and like most shonen series, you know, there are a lot of different story arcs. Now, there's a lot of smaller stuff, but the way I see it, there's really only 3 major arcs, and it follows the students from where we started off to their graduation. Pretty much all of these story arcs are consistently engaging. As you would expect, a lot of new witches get introduced with a lot of new powers. It really shakes things up, makes things super interesting, mainly because, you know, you never know when a witch is gonna show up, you never know what powers they're gonna have, you don't know if there's people we've already seen under different witches' powers. We don't know if we've already seen a witch. We don't even know why people have these powers. Like what the crap is going on with this school. There are a ton of plot twists that completely caught me off guard, but you know, once you actually go back with those plot twists in mind, you realize that they make a ton of sense. But this is mainly a romantic comedy, so let's talk about those 2 elements. The comedy here is very funny. This is definitely the funniest manga I have ever read, in my opinion. And like I said, it's constantly lighthearted and goofy, you know, a ton of jokes going around, a ton of gags. The characters are just in general very very likable and funny people. A lot of hilarious situations happen that I won't dare to spoil. And as for the romance, there is a central romance in this story that's almost impossible to guess. You'll never be able to tell who the central romance focuses on. But in my opinion, it is done very well. One of the best things about the series is how it doesn't take itself too seriously. But occasionally, if we need some more plot, character, romance development, it knows when to lay off the jokes and be a little bit more serious. The series never gets like super serious or dark or anything, but you know, if more time needs to be spent on story elements, then the manga is definitely alright with putting the comedy aside for a bit and, you know, dealing with the plot. Which is great because that makes the comedy always welcome and it never gets in the way of the actual plot progression. There was very little in this manga that felt like filler. There are a lot more romantic elements in the story, but they never overshadow the main romance and they're mostly just played for comedy. Now, as for a few negatives, while I was really satisfied with the ending, I thought the last couple chapters were great, I kind of feel like the final story arc sort of came out of nowhere. It's not one of the main 3 story arcs I was talking about earlier. It's very short and it's maybe only like the last 15 chapters of the manga. The reason I feel like it comes out of nowhere is because the arc before it was crazy. Like there was nothing else like it. It was crazy, it had a huge climax, and overall it was awesome, and I was really expecting, you know, just the rest of the manga to be wrap-up stuff. But all of a sudden they introduced this crazy conflict, unlike anything we've seen before. It seems to come out of nowhere, and then in just a few chapters they solve it and the manga ends. So it was a little weird. It's almost like they intended this arc to be either a bit longer, or they just wanted to add something crazy to happen before the manga ended. But I still did enjoy it, despite it being a little out of place. And it's also worth mentioning that while we find out a lot of things about the witch powers, we learn how people become witches, but we don't actually know how these powers came to exist in the first place. So this few things held the story back just a little bit, but overall I still had an amazing time reading this series. I love the story so much. But what is a good story without good characters? And oh man, this series is full of them. So we have the protagonist and namesake of this series, Yamada. I really enjoyed this guy. He had a great personality. Like I said, he starts off as a delinquent, but you don't really understand why. Like, he seems like a decent enough guy. Everyone just seems to hate him for some reason, and eventually those things do get revealed, and oh man. Shiraishi is also a great character, but she's also like a polar opposite to Yamada. You know, she's very quiet. She enjoys being by herself and studying all the time, and I really like the friendship that the two of them had. My favorite character, though, was Miyamura, the guy who convinces them to start the Supernatural Studies Club. He was hilarious. He's more comic relief than anything, but I loved him so much. The other characters who eventually end up joining the Supernatural Studies Club were also a time and a half. Some of the other witches we meet are also awesome too. Now, there are a lot of them, so there are definitely some that get more development than others, but the ones that get a lot of development I found to be fantastic characters, especially Noah. She was another one of my favorite characters. Now, there aren't really many villains in this series. You could argue that the Student Council, they're the antagonists for a good portion of the series, but really it's more so that, you know, both parties don't really know the whole story. So there are a lot of conflicting opinions, mainly because people don't know entirely what's going on. There are also a few misunderstood witches abusing their powers that they need to deal with. So while there were a few interesting characters that I did wish got a lot more development, overall I'd say this is an excellent cast of characters. And even when characters don't get much development, they really make an impact. If you don't know, I originally read like 150 chapters of the series, then waited like almost 2 years before I reread the entire thing for this review. But when I went back to reread it, I could still remember all of the characters. I couldn't necessarily remember all the things that happened in the story, but I could definitely remember all of the characters and all of their personalities. And I'm so shocked that all of this has come from an assistant of Hiro fucking Mashima. Let's talk about the art. It looks a lot like Fairy Tail. I mean, it's obviously not the mangaka's fault. She would do backgrounds for his art. She probably practiced her own art based on his. The art is one of the only high points in Fairy Tail, and the art here is also pretty fantastic. I say it looks like Fairy Tail, but I mean, it definitely has its own identity. But everything just looks great. The characters super well designed, and the backgrounds are super detailed. And I know it's a high school, it's a bit of a generic setting. You know, we've seen millions of those before in manga. But you know, everything looks really great. The comedy bits and the expressions are absolutely phenomenal. The characters do an excellent job expressing themselves, and overall it was a very nice manga to look at. One thing that took me out of it though was the hair colors. I know that's a bit weird, and I know the manga's in black and white, but when you're reading a manga in black and white and, you know, you see a character for the first time, you're like, oh, their hair isn't colored in, they must have blonde hair, or their hair is colored in, they must have black hair. And then you see a color page or the cover of a volume, and all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, this character has neon pink hair, this character has light blue hair, this character has dark green hair. It made no sense to me. I'm like, what? Why do all of these crazy hair colors exist? And now, still on the topic of art, why don't we talk about the fan service. Because honestly, this is probably one of the biggest turnoffs when someone initially looks at this series. They'll see this volume cover and be like, yo, what is this ecchi shit? No. And yes, I do admit, a lot of the volume covers do seem over-sexualized. A lot of the color art is very over-sexualized. And of course, a lot of the manga is over-sexualized. But I also feel like, taken out of context, it can be very misleading. Because almost every single time fanservice shows up in this manga, it is solely for the purpose of being funny. There was never a time when a character was half naked, or talking about boob sizes, or just getting straight up yaoi in your face, where it wasn't trying to tell a joke, and the majority of the time, all the jokes were really funny. If you have a comedy series with guys and girls switching bodies, that type of stuff's gonna happen. Still, if you're not a fan of fan service, this may be a turn-off, but it's really worth mentioning that it never gets in the way of the plot or the story or the character development. Anytime the series isn't trying to be funny, then you are not going to see any fan service. It's very different from Fairy Tail in that sense. So those were my thoughts on Yamada-Kun and the Seven Witches. This is honestly one of my favorite series. It's definitely not perfect, and chances are it may not be one of your favorite series. There's a chance you may not even like it. But for me, it had such an engaging story with great characters, and it was consistently hilarious, and I had a complete blast reading it from beginning to end, and I give it my final score of 6 out of 7 witches. So if anything I said has made you interested in picking up the manga for yourself, 12 out of 28 of the volumes have been released by Kodansha, and chances are they will continue to release those until they finish them. But if you are an unemployed college student like myself, you can find the entire manga available up on Crunchyroll. If you have a premium subscription, the entire thing is there for you to read. There is also a 12-episode anime series, which honestly, if you're a fan of the manga, I find it hard to recommend, mainly because it takes the first major arc of the story, which is like 10 volumes long, and squishes it down to 12 episodes of anime. So while it's still enjoyable, it just leaves way too much out. However, if you are a fan of the anime and haven't read the manga, I implore you to read it because you're probably going to love it. And as per usual, shitty live action thing. So that was my review for Yamada-Kun and the Seven Witches. Thank you guys so much for watching. You can leave your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you guys in a few weeks for my long anticipated review.
つまらない日常にあなたは笑って道を描いたこんな違う僕ら出会うはずもないはずもなかったさ泣かない